Hello, and welcome to Unheard by MindBrews, a podcast where real stories shape the way we see the world. Here, we bring together different voices to share honest conversations that challenge how we think and inspire fresh ideas. Our goal is simple: to create meaningful discussions that leave a lasting impact. Join us as we explore the stories that connect us all. Disclaimer: this article delves into unsettling psychological and physiological extremes that may not be everyone's cup of tea. Not for the faint hearted, it explores the gruesome and eerie effects of sleep deprivation, hallucinations, and intense psychological suffering, along with a fictional story designed to tap into primal fears and historical horrors. Please proceed with caution, especially if topics like severe mental health and physical distress are uncomfortable for you. The story begins in 1947, in the heart of Soviet Russia, a nation still licking its wounds after World War II. Five men, political prisoners, plucked from the darkest cells of a Siberian gulag, were chosen for this experiment. They were told nothing of the true horrors that awaited them, only that if they survived 30 days without sleep, they would be granted freedom. A promise, empty though it was, dangled before their eyes. Among these men was Alexander, a former officer who had dared to speak out against the regime. Now, he found himself part of an experiment that sought to bend the limits of human endurance. The chamber where they were confined was no ordinary room. It was a steel-prisoned, airtight room with a constant hiss of gas that filled the air. The gas was a stimulant, designed to keep the prisoners awake. Its effects were unknown. This was not a scientific study. This was an ordeal. A trial by fire. The chamber itself was sparse, almost barren. A few cots without bedding, a toilet, and enough dried food to last over a month. There were no distractions, no means of escape, just each other's company, and the growing, oppressive weight of sleeplessness. On the first day, everything seemed eerily calm. Alexander was a former military officer, and he stood with four others, promised the freedom. The air was thick with the hiss of gas. There were no clocks, no bedding, just metal walls. The gas crept into their lungs, but the real effects hadn't hit yet. Alexander was still sharp, maintaining his composure. He noticed that the others were tense, but they exchanged stories, fragments of their life before their imprisonment. It was almost comforting at first, but even on that first day, there was a sense of dread. Something hung in the air, something unseen. The chamber felt like a tomb, and though they spoke, an unspoken understanding loomed. They were no longer men, but subjects. Alexander tried to keep the pace, made light jokes. 30 days, nothing, we've all survived worse, right? The others chuckled weakly. No one truly believed it. The chamber was already starting to feel smaller, the walls a bit closer, but they stayed awake. By the second day, the first signs of stress began to show. Alexander woke after a first hours of fitful rest, but rest was the wrong word. He hadn't really slept. None of them had. The gas prevented it. Ivan, the youngest prisoner, was pacing already, muttering under his breath. "I just need to close my eyes for a second," he whispered. But they all knew it wasn't allowed. Sergei, always brooding in the corner, had already stopped talking to the others. He stared into the reflective glass, his eyes wide, as if waiting for something, someone, to look back. Alexander could sense the tension building. It wasn't just the lack of sleep, it was the gas. It felt like it was creeping into their brains, altering their thoughts. At this point, no one complained. But Alexander noticed how quickly conversations ended, how they each started to withdraw. He tried to keep everyone calm, focusing on the reward and the freedom. "We've made it through war," Alexander reminded them. "We can make it through this." But even he was starting to feel a gnawing fear. By day 3, things began to shift dramatically. Alexander could feel the weight of exhaustion crushing down on them. The gas may have kept them awake, but it couldn't stop the mental toll. Ivan was the first to crack. They're watching us, he whispered to Alexander, his eyes wild. I can feel it. I can feel they want us to fail. Alexander, still trying to lead, ever the leader, tried to reassure him. No one is watching. They'll set us free if we make it. You don't have to worry about anything. Just stay awake. But Ivan wouldn't listen. He kept pacing, his fingers twitching like he wanted to scratch his own skin off. Alexander could feel the paranoia spreading, creeping like a shadow across the room. By the evening of day 3, they had stopped speaking to each other altogether. Ivan refused to sit still, and Sergei was already avoiding the others, keeping his back pressed against the wall. It wasn't just the gas anymore. It was something more, something primal. Alexander could sense it. The growing fear, the suspicion in each glance. Something was very wrong, deeply wrong, but they just couldn't place it. On day 4, the silence became unbearable. The conversations had ended, and the prisoners avoided eye contact. Alexander sat on his cot, eyes fixed on the steel walls, trying to hold onto his sanity. His thoughts began to fracture, as if his mind was being pulled apart at the seams. Was it the gas, or was it simply the isolation? Ivan, who had barely slept, was now muttering to himself. In the corner, his voice barely audible, he stared at the microphone in the ceiling, convinced it wasn't listening to every single word that he was saying. They're recording everything. I know they are. I'm telling you, they're recording everything that we're saying, he whispered. They know what we're thinking. Sergei, always stoic, had taken to glaring at the others from across the room. His eyes never blinked. His fingers twitched occasionally, as if he was ready to strike. Alexander could see the madness setting in. He tried to speak to Sergei, to keep him grounded, but Sergei only stared, his lips curled into a tight, grim line. By the end of day 4, they were no longer a group. They were 5 isolated minds, trapped into their own personal hells, each prisoner locked in a battle with their own thoughts. Alexander felt the gas digging deeper into his brain, and for the first time, he began to wonder, were they even being watched anymore, or had they been left here to rot? Day 5. This was the breaking point, rather a turning point. Ivan, who had barely slept in days, was the first one to break. Early in the morning, he stood in the middle of the room, trembling. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips cracked and dry, and then, without warning, he began to scream. It was as if the sound was inhuman completely. A guttural, he ran back and forth, that echoed through, clawing at the walls, at his skin, at his face. His screams grew louder and louder, until his voice gave away, and all that was left were faint, hoarse gasps. The others were watching. All of the others were watching, standing far away from Ivan, but they didn't react. They were shocked. Alexander felt frozen, unable to move. The gas had kept them awake, but it had taken something else from them. Their empathy, their humanity. Ivan's screams faded into nothing, and he collapsed onto the floor, twitching, his body broken, but still conscious. He was alive, but just barely. That night, the whispers began. Sergei, who had remained silent for days, started muttering to himself, his voice a low, rasping whisper. "They're coming," he said, over and over again. "They're coming for us." Alexander tried to reason with him, but Sergei's eyes were empty, his mind lost to the gas and sleeplessness. The fear that had been building for days finally boiled over, and Alexander felt it too. The growing sense of doom, the creeping realization that they might never make it out of here alive. Day 6. By the 6th day, the chamber had become a suffocating coffin. Alexander was barely holding on to reality. His thoughts were becoming muddled, and his once commanding voice had grown weak, barely above a whisper. It was hard to tell how much of the fear he felt was real, and how much of the gas was playing tricks on his mind. What was the gas or what was reality was so fragmented. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. It was as if the chamber was alive, closing in on them. Ivan, who had broken down the day before, lay curled in the corner, rocking back and forth, muttering to himself constantly. No food, no water, just muttering, constantly talking to himself in one corner. No one went near him. After what happened that day, everyone maintained a certain kind of distance. No one wanted to go near him. His once vibrant eyes were dull, almost lifeless, and every so often he would glance at Alexander with a look that was both desperate and accusatory. "This is your fault," his eyes seemed to say. But Ivan's lips didn't move. He just stared and rocked, occasionally whispering to himself, almost like a broken doll. Sergei, always the paranoid one, now began pacing endlessly, his eyes darting to the walls as if he expected them to collapse on him at any minute. He muttered constantly under his breath, his voice low and raspy. Sometimes Alexander would lean in and listen. He would catch whispers and snippets of his words. "They're coming. They're in the walls. They're coming. They're in the walls. They're coming. They are in the walls." Sergei had begun to tear at the walls with his bare hands, scraping the skin off his fingertips until they were raw and bleeding. His need to escape had turned into obsession. "There's something behind the walls," Sergei insisted one night, his voice shaking, eyes wide with terror. "It's the gas," Alexander replied. But even as he said it, he wasn't that sure anymore. Was it just the gas? Or was there something else? Something darker lurking just beyond their vision, feeding on their fear. By the end of the 6th day, none of them had touched the food for nearly 48 hours. Their hunger was nothing compared to the clawing exhaustion that gripped them. Every moment felt like an eternity. And sleep, what was once regarded a basic human need, became the forbidden fruit they craved but could never have. And yet, despite their mental fraying, none of them collapsed. Their bodies kept moving, kept functioning, driven by the gas that filled their lungs. It was unnatural, like they were puppets whose strings were being pulled by unseen hands. Day 7. Day 7 was when Alexander truly realized they were no longer human. Not in the way they had been, at least. Something inside them had shifted, something fundamental. They were shells, moving, breathing, but devoid of anything resembling the men who had entered the chamber. Sergei had completely withdrawn into himself. He hadn't spoken directly to anyone for over a day. He continued his scraping, his fingernails hanging by threads, but he didn't seem to notice the pain. Blood smeared the walls where he scratched, and the smell of copper filled the air, adding to the already sickening atmosphere in the chamber. Alexander tried to speak to Sergei, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Sergei, stop! You're going to hurt yourself." But Sergei didn't even acknowledge him. His eyes were fixed on the wall, as though he could see right through it, as though there was something just beyond, something that would save them. That evening, Alexander sat alone in the center of the room, feeling the crushing weight of isolation. Despite being surrounded by all the others in the room, he had stopped trying to comfort Ion, whose mutterings had devolved into senseless gibberish. The once close-knit group had splintered into fragments of insanity, each man trapped into his own private nightmare. For the first time, Alexander wondered if they would make it out alive, but another part of him, a darker part, wondered if they should. Had they gone too far already? Could they ever go back to the way things were? What would life be after all of this? Where will he go? All of these were questions constantly surrounding Alexander's mind. It was on the 7th night that Alexander had his first hallucination. He was sure of it. As he lay on the cot staring at the ceiling, he saw shapes moving above him, twisting, writhing figures, their faces obscured, but their presence undeniable. He blinked and they were gone. But the sense of dread remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He didn't tell the others. What was the point? They were all seeing things by now. Day 8. By the 8th day, the gas had taken complete control. Alexander no longer trusted his own mind. He would see things, shadows darting in the corners of the room, voices whispering in his ear, but when he turned, there was nothing there. There never seemed to be. Ivan was the first to stop moving entirely. He sat perfectly still, his eyes open but glazed, staring blankly at the far wall. Occasionally, his lips would twitch, but no sound escaped them. His body was still alive, but his mind had checked out days ago. Alexander avoided looking at him. The sight was too unsettling. It was like Ivan had become a living corpse, still breathing but devoid of life. Sergei, meanwhile, had taken to standing in the middle of the room, facing the porthole where the researchers watched. His arms were outstretched, his head tilted back as though offering himself up to something unseen. "Come for me," he screamed at the glass, his voice ragged and raw. "Take me now. Take me away. Come for me." Alexander could hear the faint clicking of the microphone as the researchers recorded everything. But there was no response, no acknowledgement. It was as if they were watching animals in a cage, detached, indifferent. Alexander tried to summon the strength to shout at them, to demand answers, but he couldn't. He was too tired, too drained. It was as though the gas had stolen his will, leaving him a hollow shell. That night, Alexander had another hallucination, or at least he thought it was a hallucination. He saw the walls of the chamber breathing, expanding and contracting like the chest of some great beast. He could hear the air rushing in and out, feeling the oppressive heat of its breath against his skin. He blinked, shook his head, and the walls were still again. But the fear lingered, burrowing deep into his mind. Sergei continued his deranged ranting. "They're in the walls, Alexander, don't you see? They've been watching us this whole time. We're animals. We're experiments. They're watching." His eyes were bloodshot, wild. Alexander knew Sergei was slipping. But then again, so was he. What if Sergei was right? What if they were being watched? Not just by the researchers, but by something else. Something older and darker. Something that lived within the walls of the chamber that Sergei had mentioned before. Day 9. By day 9, Alexander's body was failing him. His muscles ached. His joints screamed with every movement, but he couldn't rest. He couldn't sleep. The gas wouldn't allow it. His mind had become a battlefield, torn between the need for rest and the relentless, gnawing hunger for escape. Every moment felt like a struggle, not just to survive, but to remain sane. Sergei had stopped talking altogether. His rants had ceased. His pacing had ended. He now sat cross-legged in the middle of the chamber, staring at his bloodied hands. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He hadn't eaten in days, and yet he was still alive, still functioning, probably still driven solely by the stimulant gas. Alexander tried to engage him. Sergei, we need to stay together. We need to survive this. But Sergei didn't respond. He didn't even blink. Alexander feared Sergei had finally crossed that line between sanity and madness, and there was no coming back. That evening, Ivan began to scream again. His voice, raw and hoarse from the previous days, was now little more than a faint wail, but the sound was enough to send a chill down Alexander's spine. He wondered what the other four felt. Ivan clawed at his skin, raking his nails down his arms and chest, leaving deep, bleeding gouges. He screamed for hours, long after his voice had given out, his body trembling in convulsions. Alexander wanted to stop him, to pull him back from the brink, but he couldn't. He was too weak, too tired. He turned to the researchers. He screamed, "Can you stop this? Look at him! Save him!" And then, just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. Ivan collapsed on the floor, his body twitching violently before going still. For a moment, Alexander thought he was dead. But then Ivan's chest rose, slowly, unevenly. He was still alive. Barely. Alexander realized with a sickening clarity that there was no escape from this. They were just prisoners in a chamber. They were prisoners in their own minds, trapped by the gas, by the sleeplessness, but the very walls that surrounded them. And no matter what happened, they would never be free. Day 11. The 11th day began like the others, drenched in eerie silence. Alexander sitting on the floor with his back pressed against the cold steel wall, staring at his reflection in the observation window. It was becoming harder to tell where the gas-induced hallucinations ended and his reality began. The chamber felt different now, like a ticking bomb waiting to go off. Sergei, his once commanding stature, now a shell of flesh and bones, sat cold in the corner, muttering incoherently to himself. His words were a strange mix of pleading and laughter, as if the horrors in his mind had finally become his only companions. The silence from Ivan was more disturbing. He hadn't moved in hours, his eyes wide open, unblinking, fixed on something in the distance. The room felt heavier, as though an invisible weight was pressing down on Alexander's chest. They were waiting. He could feel it, waiting for something to change, for the gas to pull them deeper into this nightmare. Alexander couldn't help but feel a grim premonition. What was happening to them? What would happen? Soon. He had no idea. He didn't know. But the gnawing pit in his stomach told him that whatever came next would push them far beyond the realm of madness. Day 15. When the 15th day arrived, something did change. Without warning, the familiar hiss of the stimulant gas, which had been a constant presence in the chamber, abruptly stopped. The fresh air rushed, filling in the chamber. Everything descended into a level of chaos no one could have anticipated. The fresh air, so simple yet devoid of the stimulant gas, drove the prisoners to a frenzied state, their bodies now grotesque shells. The gas had kept the prisoners from sleep, kept their minds in a fervid state, and was suddenly gone. The prisoners had begun to awaken after so long that their minds were no longer their own. The stimulant had pushed them far past the brink of sleep deprivation and into the depths of madness. Alexander, who had once been the voice of reason, felt his lungs burn from the sudden change in the air. He gasped for breath, his body trembling with need for the gas, as though it had become as necessary as oxygen, rather replaced it. Across the room, Ivan let out a low moan, clawing at his throat as if the fresh air were choking him. His wide, bloodshot eyes darted around the chamber, filled with panic. while the other prisoners trembled, their eyes fixated on the door. And then the doors opened. What met the guards and the researchers that day was a scene of horror that could never have been predicted. Yuri, one of the prisoners, probably one of the ones who said that they want to never stay, was dead. His body lay crumpled by the drain in the center of the chamber, submerged in a pool of blood and water. His abdomen had been torn open, his organs spilling out in a grotesque display of self-destruction. The flesh of his body had been gnawed on by his fellow prisoners. The living prisoners had mutilated themselves beyond recognition. Flesh hung in tattered strips from their bodies, and they seemed to move on sheer instinct, not as men, but as creatures driven by something far more primal. Sergei, rocking back and forth in the corner, had torn open his stomach, his intestines pooling in his lap as he muttered to himself, a twisted smile on his face. The guards, too stunned to speak and horrified, tried to pull the prisoners out of the chamber, but the survivors fought back with the viciousness that no one could have anticipated. Their frail bodies broken and mutilated, lashed out with inhuman strength. Alexander watched as Ivan, who had once been a quiet and broken man, lunged at one of the guards with wild, feral eyes. The guard was forced to shoot Ivan down, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the chamber like a final death knell. Even in their dying moments, the prisoners refused to leave their chamber. They screamed, clawed, and begged to be returned to the gas, to the thing that had turned them into these monsters. When asked why they had mutilated themselves, their responses were eerily uniform: "I must remain awake." The researchers, now deeply unnerved by what they had unleashed, wanted to end the experiment. The only solution seemed to be wiping the prisoners and the entire experiment from existence. But the military commander overseeing the project had other plans. He demanded that the experiment be resumed, that the prisoners be returned to their chamber with the researchers joining them. Faced with the prospect of sealing himself into the nightmare they had created, the chief researcher snapped, his mind already teetering on the edge after witnessing the horrors of the last 15 days, finally broke. In one swift motion, he drew his sidearm and shot the commander point blank. The shot echoed through the now bloody chamber, cutting through the screams, cutting through the madness. Without hesitation, the researcher turned the gun on the remaining prisoners. They too had to be silenced. Their existence was proof of the horrors mankind was capable of when pushed too far. With a final fatal shot, he put down the last of the prisoners. The echoes of their madness hung in the air like a curse, and the chamber, once filled with gas, blood, and chaos, fell silent. Alexander was lying over there, in the middle of the chamber, looking up, and in his last moments, he took a breath, a deep breath, and smiled. This is the end of Alexander's story, but it is also a cautionary tale for us all. The Russian sleep experiment, whether real or a figment of our darkest imaginations, reminds us of one simple truth. There are some lines we never mean to cross. Some doors should remain closed, and some questions, especially those about the limits of the human mind, should never be answered. As you lie down tonight and sleep takes over, remember Alexander and the others. Remember the dark places your mind can wander when the light of consciousness flickers and fades. And be thankful for that when you close your eyes. You're not trapped in a nightmare that never ends. Sleep tight if you can. And join us for another podcast episode next week by MindBrews. Subscribe if you haven't already. Please comment and tell us what you thought about this episode. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night and a great sleep.